Hi, just a quick reminder that this podcast has merch, a Patreon, a Fiverr gig, and some affiliated links. The links to everything I just mentioned will be in the show notes. Alright, now enjoy the show. I need to give you a content warning before we start this episode. This is a really heavy story that I'm about to tell. This story is right up there with Catherine Howard and Virginia Woolf. So if you've listened to those episodes, then you know that this is a depressing story. In this episode, I'm going to talk about child death, suicide, violence, bullying, and sexual abuse. So, listener discretion is highly advised. Every so often, the discussion of the importance that art plays in our lives comes up. We are witnessing more and more art programs being taken away from our youth. There are people out there that like to undermine the impact that the arts have on us. They claim that they are nothing. No, listening to a song cannot fill an empty stomach. Taking a relaxing evening and watching a movie is not going to pay your mortgage. And reading a spicy romance novel won't stop you from bleeding out if you are wounded. But if all we are doing is just surviving, then what is the point of living? No, art can't cure you of a terminal illness. But can you honestly say that you haven't felt better by listening to your favorite song or getting lost in a gripping novel? Can you truly say that you have never felt seen when you see a person on the screen go through similar struggles as you? Or moved by a painting because it was somehow able to convey an emotion that you didn't have the words for? Can you honestly say that you have never used art to escape? For one girl in Brooklyn over a century ago, art was all she had. And that's not nothing. Hi, my name is Courtney Jewell, and you are listening to the 7th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf, a podcast about history that proves that sometimes fact is even more interesting than fiction. Welcome to Season 5 of History Shelf. This season is titled History, Taylor's Version. That is because these 14 people that I will be covering this season all have one thing in common. The one thing they have in common is they all have been name-dropped in a Taylor Swift song. Now, don't stop listening if you are not a fellow Swiftie like me. This season is not going to be about Taylor Swift. You don't have to be a Swiftie to enjoy this season. You just have to be a history lover. So please, stay. What we are going to do is you and I are going to go on a little adventure that spans 2,404 years. Who I am going to cover this season are fearless leaders, people from the screen, poets straight from the Tortured Poets department, and people who were just trying to find a place in this world. Some of these stories may be stories of happiness. They may be sad, beautiful, tragic, but long story short, I hope that you will be enchanted to get to know the stories of these historical figures all too well. So, are you ready for it? For this week, I am talking about Clara Bow. Clara Gordon Bow was born in Brooklyn, New York, United States on July 29, 1905. Or at least that is what we believe to be true. The U.S. Census of 1910 and 1920 say her birth year was 1905, but the 1930 U.S. Census and her gravestone say her birth year was 1907. Most sources accept 1905 as being her birth year. Clara grew up in poverty, just like history alumni Greta Garbo did. In fact, if you have already listened to the episode I did on Greta Garbo, then you are going to notice that Clara and Greta had a lot in common. Clara's mother was Sarah Frances Gordon, and her father was Robert Walter Bow. Clara was not Sarah and Robert's only child, but she was the only one that survived infancy. Clara had two older sisters. Her oldest sister was named Aline. Aline was born prematurely on June 25th, 1903. She died 3 days later. Clara's second sister was named Emily. Emily was also born prematurely. She was born on May 13th, 1904. Emily only lived 2 hours after her birth, and it was a birth that almost killed Clara's mother. Clara's parents were so poor that neither Aline or Emily got a gravestone because their parents simply could not afford it. So they both were buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. Since Sarah almost died giving birth to Emily, her doctor warned her that if she got pregnant again, the birth would be fatal to both baby and mother. But despite the doctor's warning, Sarah got pregnant again, obviously. It is believed that the reason why Sarah got pregnant again was because she was trying to commit suicide. Sarah was unhappy. She did not love Clara's father, Robert, but Robert loved Sarah. This caused Robert to be absent from the home often. Clara later said this about her parents' marriage, quote, "I do not think my mother ever loved my father. He knew it, and it made him very unhappy, for he worshipped her always." Sarah wasn't the warmest person in the world, but with a background like hers, it is easy to understand why. Sarah's father was a man named Frederick Gordon. Frederick ruled with an iron fist over his wife and 6 children. When he wasn't drinking, he was beating his wife. Sarah looked around at her mother's life, and she vowed that she would never live that way. And her life not only almost ended during childbirth, but it also almost ended when she was 16. She was leaning out of a second-story window to pick some grapes for her brother, and she fell headfirst out of the window. Sarah suffered from epilepsy due to her fall and another fall that I will talk about a little later on. Her epilepsy caused psychotic episodes. I tell you all of this not because this episode is about Sarah Gordon, because it is not, but because Sarah's condition forced Clara to care for her mother when she was growing up. Clara said herself, quote, "As a kid, I took care of my mother. She didn't take care of me," end quote. There was actually nothing normal about Clara and Sarah's relationship. Sarah didn't show Clara motherly love. This is Clara again, quote, "When she was mean to me, and she often was, though I know she didn't mean to be, and that it was because she couldn't help it, it broke my heart," end quote. Clara's life was hard from the very start. I told you earlier that she was born in Brooklyn. She was born in Prospect Heights in Brooklyn at 697 Bergen Street, to be exact. I already told you that Clara's parents didn't have the happiest marriage. Sarah would often nag at Robert and mock his dream of being a singing waiter. Robert was a busboy, and that was a fact that Sarah reminded him of often. Robert got fed up and left Sarah while she was pregnant with Clara, forcing Sarah to move in with her brother at 697 Bergen Street. Her brother's apartment was a barely furnished room above a dilapidated Baptist church. Clara was born during the middle of a heat wave. Temperatures got up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 38 degrees Celsius. The heat wave was causing infant mortality rate to go up to 80%. Sarah did not believe that her or Clara would survive the birth, so when she went into labor, she didn't send for a doctor. Instead, her own mother, who was not mentally stable, served as a midwife. Clara seemed dead when she was born, which Sarah was glad about. But she, of course, was not dead. Clara wrote this about her birth, quote, I don't suppose two people ever looked death in the face more clearly than my mother and I the morning I was born. We were both given up, but somehow we struggled back to life." End quote. Clara's father went back to Clara's mother after her birth. Robert named Clara after his sister-in-law, but they did not get a birth certificate for Clara because they didn't think that she would live long. But Clara would grow to be a child with auburn hair, high cheekbones, and blackish brown eyes. Robert would disappear for months at a time, and when he was around, he would repeatedly physically abuse Clara. He would slap her so hard that she would hit the ground, and he would whip her with his leather razor strop. Even though Sarah hated him, she moved in with her father, Frederick. Frederick adored Clara and treated her with kindness that he never showed his wife or any of his children. January 20th, 1909 brought a devastating loss for Clara. Frederick was pushing Clara on the swing when he had an apoplectic fit. He died the next day. Sarah told Clara that she wished Clara had been the one that had died. In 1911, Sarah took another fall. This time, it was down some stairs. It is possible that she was trying to kill herself. This brought on Sarah's epilepsy. The trauma that Clara endured as a child made her develop a stammer. This and her clothes that were made from Sarah's tattered shirtwaists caused other girls to tease her. And as for the boys, well, if they caused her any trouble, she would just use her fists to take care of them. Clara was a real tough kid. She could handle her shit. When Clara was 4.5 years old, her father was out of work. Her and her parents moved around a lot. From the years 1905 to 1923, they lived at 14 different addresses, seldom outside of Prospect Heights. Growing up, Clara had a best friend named Johnny. One day, Clara heard the agonizing screams of Johnny. What she found was Johnny was on fire. Johnny cried out for Clara. Clara wrapped Johnny in a carpet, but it was too late. Johnny died in Clara's arms. Through all of her hard times, Clara always had the movies. Movies were her escape. Watching people on the screen set off a spark in Clara. But being an actress was not Clara's first dream. Clara first wanted to be an athletics instructor. She won 5 medals at the Cedar track. But eventually she knew that she wanted to be seen on the big screen. Unlike the last person that I covered on this podcast, Salvador Dali, Clara did not have a mother that was supportive of her dreams. Sarah was the exact opposite, in fact. Sarah believed that all actresses were prostitutes, and even though on occasion Sarah had been a prostitute, she was not going to let Clara become one. Plus, she needed Clara. She needed Clara to be her nurse, maid, companion, confidant, and victim to her tyranny. Sarah would instill in her daughter anxiety that she would carry for the rest of her life. But through it all, Clara loved her mother. She idolized her. When Sarah wasn't busy forcing her daughter to live under her thumb, she was teaching her that all men are evil and women must control them any way they can. When the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1918 broke out, the Bows moved to the opposite of Brooklyn. Clara's new neighbor was the amusement park Coney Island. This short period of Clara's childhood was pleasant. Clara's father found work again as a busboy at Coney Island. For a year, Sarah was even kind to Clara. She would curl Clara's hair and make her clothes that was not made from her rags. Clara wanted to share her dream to be a movie star with this new kind mother. Her mother, in return, told Clara that she had no talent and that she was, quote, the ugliest little mutt in the family, end quote. Clara listened to her mother, and she believed her. But not everyone in Clara's life believed that she was talentless. A school teacher of hers saw the untapped potential in Clara. She cast Clara as Priscilla in the school play of Miles Standish. Clara practiced her lines over and over, and her stammer went away. In February of 1919, Sarah became even more hostile. Clara was washing clothes in a wash tub when Sarah came up behind her. Sarah told Clara, quote, "I think I'll kill ya. This is a terrible world. You'd be better off dead," end quote. Sarah had no memory of doing this, and Sarah would have spells like this where she would say or do something, but after the spell, she wouldn't be able to recall what she had said or did. Clara told her father about what her mother had said. Robert took Sarah to a charity clinic, and they said that she suffered from a nervous disease, and there was nothing that could be done. It was clear that Clara should not be left alone with Sarah, so they moved in with a relative in Prospect Place. Clara was pulled out of school because now she needed to find a job. She was in the 8th grade, and she never got to be Priscilla. Clara got a job at Nathan's, that is a Coney Island hot dog stand. She sliced hot dog buns there. The next year, she was answering phone calls at a doctor's office, though she left quickly when she found out that the doctor was an abortionist. But Clara never gave up hope of being on the big screen. Clara was a fan of the magazine Motion Picture. In that magazine in January of 1921 was where Clara found the Fame and Fortune contest. It was sponsored by a Brooklyn-based company which published motion picture called Brewster Publications. The judges of this contest were Howard Chandler Christie, Harrison Fisher, and Nisha McMean, all famous commercial artists. The grand prize of this contest was a part in a motion picture. This was it. This was the big break that Clara had been dreaming of. But she had a problem. She needed 2 photographs of herself. She didn't have that, and she didn't have the money to get the photos. So she turned to her father. He took her to a cheap photographer's studio in Coney Island. Clara was crestfallen when the photos came out looking terrible. But it was what she had. So she took the photos to the Brewster offices. And it was a good thing that she delivered the photos in person because the manager of the contest wrote on the terrible photos that Clara was pretty in person. Clara had her doubts that she would win, though. On September 2nd, 1921, she and other contestants had screen tests. A week later, she and other finalists had more tests. Sometimes timing is a real bitch. And during this time, a woman by the name of Virginia Rapp died of a ruptured bladder after attending a Labor Day party hosted by the actor Fatty Arbuckle. A rumor began that Fatty had violated Virginia with a champagne bottle. Then it appeared that it was due to a botched abortion. This was just further proof to Sarah that all actresses were whores. So Clara did not tell her mother about the contest. Clara kept advancing in the contest. Soon it was down to just her and a woman named Lula Hubbard. One day, Sarah wanted to know where Clara had been, and Clara told her the truth. Sarah fainted, and Clara thought that she had killed her mother. When Sarah woke, she told Clara that she was going straight to hell. She told her that she would rather see Clara dead. Clara, crying, thinking that she had caused her mother's condition, swore to her mother that she would give up her dream of acting. 3 days later, it was announced that Clara was the winner of the contest. Brewster got better photos of Clara and got her a nice outfit. Clara struggled with guilt about her mother. She thought that she was making her worse. The movie that Clara was put in was titled Beyond the Rainbow. The director, Christy Caban, basically called Clara ugly. He told his assistant, quote, "Don't tell me she won a beauty contest," end quote, even though it had been a talent contest and not a beauty contest that Clara had won. Clara ran from his office in tears. Brewster convinced Christie to hire her by giving him free publicity for his film. She was cast as Virginia Gardner in the film, and she made $50 for 1 week of work. But Clara had to supply 4 dresses from her own wardrobe. But Clara only had 2 dresses. So she went to her rich aunt and namesake and asked her if she would help her. That Clara Bow threw our Clara Bow out of her house without helping her. She also wrote to Clara's father, telling him that Clara had disgraced the family. But a cousin of Clara's loaned her $80 so she could buy some dresses. The movie didn't have makeup artists working on set. The actors had to do their own makeup themselves, and Clara didn't know how to do that. She asked 4 actresses if they would help her, but none of them were a girl's girl, and they told her to figure it out like they had to. Her first attempt at applying her own makeup did not go well. The asshole director swore in disgust. In the first scene, she had to cry. The director didn't think that she would be able to do it, but he was surprised and shocked when she did. Clara later said, quote, "It was easy for me to cry. All I had to do was think of home," end quote. After Clara had finished filming Beyond the Rainbow, Clara woke up one night to a butcher knife hovering above her. The person holding the butcher knife was her mother. Sarah told Clara that she was going to murder her. She told her that it would be better if she killed her. She pinned Clara's hands to the bed and raised the knife to Clara's throat. Then she fainted. Sarah could not recall the incident the next morning. Clara said this about the event, quote, "There was one night in Brooklyn, it was snowing. My mother and I were cold and hungry. We had been cold and hungry for days. We lay in each other's arms and cried and tried to keep warm. It grew worse and worse. So that night my mother, but I can't tell you about it. Only when I remember it, it seems to me I can't live," end quote. Anytime Clara was forced to talk about her early days, she would tremble and grow white. After the butcher knife incident with her mother, Clara suffered, understandably, from insomnia. On February 1st, 1922, the director William Desmond Taylor was murdered. His murder was never solved, but the actresses Mary Miles Minter and Mabel Normand were implicated in it. It went around that the 2 actresses were not so virtuous. That just added more fuel to Sarah's fire. Sarah kept giving Clara death threats. Clara was rightfully terrified. And I just want to remind you that at this time, Clara was only 16 years old. Clara had invited 2 girls from school to the premiere of Beyond the Rainbow on February 19th, 1922. She did this as a way to show those mean girls that she had made something of herself. But Christy Caban had cut her out of the film along with many other actors. Later, her scenes would be restored, and she would even get billing above the star of the film, actress Billy Dove. But for now, Clara was devastated. Sarah saw it as her duty to kill Clara before she made another movie, so she chased Clara around their flat with a butcher knife. She kicked Clara out of the house to roam the streets with the rest of the, quote, whores. For 2 days, Clara wandered around Coney Island, but then her father, Robert, found her and brought her back home. Robert didn't want to care for Sarah, so even though Clara didn't want him to because she still loved her mother, Robert, on February 24th, 1922, committed Sarah to an asylum. Sarah was at the same facility her mom had been committed to by her husband, Sarah's father. Clara said she suffered a breakdown during this time. Clara moved into an apartment with her father in the Bay Ridge section of Brooklyn. There she cooked her father's meals, washed his clothes, and cleaned the apartment. It was in that apartment where Clara's father started to rape Clara repeatedly. Clara explained his actions away by telling herself that that was just the way that he expressed his love for her. That would be something that she would tell herself even 3 decades later. During this time, Clara continued to look for work in film, but studios and agencies turned her away. They would tell her that she was too young, too little, or mostly too fat, which just shows you how ridiculous the beauty standards were even back then, because Clara Bow was not fat. Director Elmer Clifton saw the winner announcement of the Fame and Fortune contest that Clara had won. He thought Clara would be perfect for a part in his movie Down to the Sea in Ships. Clara borrowed a dress and wore heavy makeup when she went to go meet Elmer. She thought that it would be the look that he was looking for, but it made her look older than she was. Elmer told Clara that she was too old for the part. He didn't believe her when she told him that she was only 16. She ran home, put on shabby clothing, and took off her makeup. He hired her for a 2-week trial period, making $35 a week. That 2 weeks turned into 13 weeks on location in New Bedford, Massachusetts. When Clara was done with filming, she returned to New York and went straight to the asylum where her mother was. Sarah ordered Clara to get her out of the asylum. Clara went home and begged her father to release her mother. He refused. So Clara went to a cousin and asked her to get her out. The cousin felt bad, but she didn't want a woman that was mentally unstable to live in her home. But by October of 1922, Sarah was released from the asylum because it was declared that she had recovered. Clara rented a room for both her and her mother. Sarah didn't try to kill Clara again or tell her to quit acting, but she also was not supportive of Clara's career. She just ignored it. William Randolph Hearst's Cosmopolitan Pictures hired Clara as an unbilled extra on Enemies of Women. Sarah wanted to tag along to the studio one day, but Clara told her no. Sarah got mad and she lapsed into a catatonic state, and she would have spells where she gasped for her breath. Sarah laid on the couch rigid for days. Clara told no one about her mother's condition. Sarah's freedom was short-lived. On New Year's Eve of 1922, Sarah was put back into the asylum. Robert had authorized a transfer to the same state mental institution where Sarah's mother had died. But a day before her transfer, Sarah died on January 5th, 1923. She died of heart disease. The secondary cause listed on her birth certificate is psychosis due to epilepsy. Robert went to the set of Enemies of Women to tell Clara that her mother had passed away. Clara was in a numb state at her mother's funeral until Sarah's coffin was lowered into the ground. Clara tried to jump in after her mother. Clara felt guilty over her mother's death. She thought that her film career had made Sarah's illness worse. Clara wanted to quit acting, but her father talked her out of it. But don't think that he did that to be a loving and supportive father. He was motivated by greed. Clara made more money than he did. Down to the Sea and Ships did not receive good reviews, but critics loved Claire's performance. Arthur Jacobson was a second cameraman for the Film Guild. They were a group of Ivy League graduates that made independently financed movies on minuscule budgets. Arthur did every screen test for the film Grit. Clara was cast as Orchid McGonagall in that film. Clara went up to Arthur to thank him, and a few days later, the couple were in love. The two quickly couldn't get enough of each other. Clara felt comfortable enough around Arthur to talk about her mother's illness. Robert, for the most part, ignored Clara, but around other men, he was overprotective. Arthur wanted some alone time with Clara, so Arthur got a cousin of his to invite Robert to a regular Saturday night game of pinochle. So Clara and Arthur would have the apartment all to themselves, and Arthur's cousin would call when Robert left. Clara and Arthur would then go outside and sit on the stoop. Grit was another bomb, but once again, Clara was praised for her work. Her talent got her noticed by an officer of Preferred Pictures, an independent production and distribution company based in Hollywood, California. The officer's name was Jack Bachman. He offered Clara train fare to travel to Hollywood for a 3-month trial period at $50 a week. And that was the first part of Clara Bow's life. Thank you so much for listening to the 7th episode of the 5th season of History Shelf. Next week's episode will be Clara Bow Part 2. I will tell you whether or not she took the deal with Preferred Pictures. I hope you come back for that. A few things before we go. If you want to follow this podcast on social media, the TikTok is at History Shelf. The Instagram is at history_shelf_pod. The Twitter is at History Shelf Pod, and the Facebook page is History Shelf Podcast. If you want to help out this podcast financially, there are a few ways you can do that. One is you can buy merch from the History Shelf merch store, or you can become a Patreon. This podcast is always going to be free, but there are some perks that come along with becoming a Patreon. The first tier is called History Student, and that is $1 a month. And with that, I will give you a shout out on all social media platforms that History Shelf is on. Also, I will choose one Patreon at random for each episode I do, and at the end of that episode, I will give that Patreon a shout out. The second tier is called History Fan, and that is $3 a month, and with that, you get the first tier. Plus, you get to vote in a poll that helps me choose a theme for the next season of this podcast. The third tier is called History Buff, and that is $20 a month, and with that, you get the first 2 tiers. Plus, you'll get a handwritten note of thanks spelled to you from me. And the last tier is called History Lover, and that is $40 a month, and with that, you get the first 3 tiers. Plus, you get to choose one item from the History Shelf merch store. You can choose any item that you want, except for the Zip-Up Putty. You can also take out ad space on this podcast. I have a gig on Fiverr that lets you do that. Also, if you click on one of the affiliated links and buy something, that helps support the podcast. But if you don't want any of the merch, you don't want any of the perks, and you don't want to buy anything, but you still want to help support the podcast, I turned on listener support on Spotify for podcasters. The links to everything that I just mentioned will be in the show notes. But as always, the best way that you can help support this podcast is just to continue to listen to it. And there are a few other ways you can help out for free. One is if you are listening on a platform that lets you rate this podcast 5 stars and or leave a positive review. If you do that, that would be very helpful. Also, sharing this podcast on social media with your friends and family would be very helpful. Alright, well, until next time, keep learning, keep loving history, and come back for next week's episode. Bye.